The afternoon Byron Johnson chose his date for his sister's wedding. He didn't pick a socialite, a model, or the daughter of a business partner. He walked into the accounting department on the third floor and pointed at the bookkeeper. Janet Doiron froze with the ledger in her hand, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Every muscle in her body tensed, every thought scattered. Byron Johnson never joked, he never wasted words, and he never repeated himself. The office was silent except for the distant hum of the air conditioning and the muted clicking of keyboards. It was just past 3 o'clock, and Janet was finishing a quarterly report, trying to stay unnoticed the way she always did. She liked blending into spreadsheets and columns. She liked being invisible. But today, invisibility was impossible. Byron stood in the doorway between the cubicles and the conference room, still wearing the charcoal three-piece suit from a morning meeting that had clearly run late. His tie was loosened just slightly, revealing the strong line of his throat and the edge of what might have been an old scar. His dark blonde hair was perfectly styled, his jaw set with that tension she recognized from the quarterly briefings, and his eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach drop. "Miss Doiron," Byron said, because he never called anyone by their first name unless he owned them. She set down the ledger carefully because her hands had started to tremble. Her reading glasses were perched on her nose, her hair pulled back in a sensible bun, her gray cardigan buttoned over a white blouse that had seen better days. She should not even be visible to him, much less the focus of whatever this was. She pushed her chair back slowly, afraid the wheels might squeak. "Mr. Johnson?" He studied her as if calculating a high-stakes investment, weighing risks she couldn't see. "You're coming with me to my sister's wedding, Saturday evening. I'll send someone for you at 4. Her throat went dry. She had been reconciling offshore accounts, her desk organized with color-coded folders, a cold cup of coffee from this morning sitting next to her monitor. She processed his money. She knew where the bodies were buried, financially speaking. She should not be in the same room with him, much less on his arm at a family event. She stood carefully, smoothing her skirt with damp palms. "I think there's been some mistake, Mr. Johnson. I'm the bookkeeper." Dominic Kane, Byron's head of security, was standing behind him in the hallway, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral. Even he looked caught off guard. Byron stepped fully into the office, his presence swallowing the fluorescent-lit space. The other accountants had gone completely still at their desks, not even pretending to work anymore. "There's no mistake." Janet's pulse hammered in her ears. "Why me?" His gaze swept over her slowly, not with desire, but with assessment. She felt seen in a way that terrified her, even though she still wore her sensible office clothes in comfortable flats that made no sound on the industrial carpet. "Every woman who wants to be on my arm," he said, his voice low and exact, "has an agenda." She blinked. "I don't understand." "You don't want anything from me," he answered, taking another step closer. "Not connections, not status, not protection." She opened her mouth to protest, to say that wasn't true, that she wanted something from everyone in this building, to stay hidden from Vincente Moretti's people, to survive long enough to gather the evidence she needed, to disappear again before anyone realized who she really was. But the words wouldn't come, because Byron Johnson was looking at her like he could see through every carefully constructed lie she'd built over the past 3 years. And for the first time since she'd taken this job, Janet wondered if being invisible had just become the most dangerous thing she could be. The first time Janet heard the elevator chime on the 3rd floor at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, she didn't think anything of it. The second time, when the doors opened and every conversation in the accounting department died mid-sentence, she looked up from her monitor. Byron Johnson stepped into the corridor between the cubicles like a storm front moving inland. He wore authority the way other men wore cologne, invisible but unmistakable. His charcoal suit was immaculate despite the late hour, his presence transforming the mundane office space into something else entirely, something dangerous. Janet's fingers stilled on her keyboard. She had worked for the Johnson organization for 3 years and had seen Byron exactly 4 times, twice in the main conference room during quarterly briefings where she sat in the back and tried not to exist, once in the parking garage when his motorcade swept past her aging Honda, and once in the lobby when she'd been careful to take the stairs instead of sharing an elevator. He had never been on the 3rd floor, ever. The accounting department occupied the least glamorous space in the Johnson building, fluorescent lights that hummed with a perpetual headache-inducing frequency, beige carpet worn thin by decades of foot traffic, and walls the color of institutional despair. This was where money got cleaned and redistributed, where offshore accounts balanced and questionable invoices received legitimate stamps. This was where people like Janet kept their heads down and their questions to themselves. Byron moved through the space with the confidence of someone who owned not just the building, but the air inside it. His eyes swept across the room with clinical precision, cataloging faces and dismissing them just as quickly. Behind him, Dominic Kane followed at a respectful distance, one hand resting casually near his jacket, a gesture Janet had learned meant he was armed and assessing threats. When Byron stopped at her desk, Janet's heart forgot how to beat properly. "Miss Doiron." His voice carried across the silent office, and she felt 30 pairs of eyes turn toward her cubicle. She stood on instinct, her chair rolling backward and hitting the partition wall with a soft thud. "Mr. Johnson," her voice came out steadier than she felt. 3 years of practice at becoming invisible, at being overlooked, and now this. He studied her with the same intensity she'd seen him use during negotiations in the few security footage clips she'd accidentally glimpsed while reconciling accounts. "You're coming with me to my sister's wedding. Saturday evening, I'll send someone for you at 4. The words landed like physical objects. Janet's mind went blank, then flooded with too many thoughts at once. This wasn't a request. This wasn't even a conversation. This was Byron Johnson informing her of a decision he'd already made, and nothing in his expression suggested he expected resistance. She started, but he cut her off with a slight movement of his hand. No arguments. His eyes held hers, and for one terrifying moment, Janet wondered if he knew, if somehow, impossibly, he'd discovered who she really was, what she was really doing in his organization, why a woman with her education and background was content to spend her days buried in spreadsheets on the 3rd floor. But his expression revealed nothing except absolute certainty. "Dominic will provide you with the details. 4 o'clock, Saturday. Don't be late." He turned and walked back toward the elevator, his security chief falling into step beside him. The doors closed with a quiet chime, and only then did the office remember how to breathe. Janet sat down slowly, her legs suddenly unreliable. Around her, whispers started spreading like wildfire through dry grass, but she couldn't hear them over the rushing sound in her ears, couldn't process anything except the impossible reality that in 4 days she would be walking into a room full of the city's most dangerous people on the arm of the man who ruled them all. And somewhere in that room, there was a very good chance Vincent Moretti's people would be watching. Sophia Johnson Castellano didn't knock before entering her brother's office. She never had. Not since they were children navigating their father's empire, learning which doors to open and which to avoid. Byron's door had always been open to her, even when it was locked to everyone else. Tonight, she wished she'd knocked. Byron sat behind his mahogany desk, a glass of bourbon untouched at his elbow, his attention fixed on a folder that Sophia knew contained security profiles for her wedding guests. He'd been vetting every name on the list for weeks, cross-referencing alliances and old grudges, making sure her special gay didn't turn into a bloodbath. It was the kind of thing that made her love him and resent him in equal measure. "Tell me it's not true," she said, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. Byron didn't look up. "You'll have to be more specific." "The bookkeeper, Byron. You're bringing the bookkeeper from the 3rd floor as your date to my wedding." She crossed the Persian rug that had belonged to their grandfather, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood where the fabric ended. "Please tell me Dominic was joking." "Dominic doesn't joke." Byron finally lifted his eyes from the folder, his expression revealing nothing. "And neither do I." Sophia braced her hands on the edge of his desk, leaning forward. At 32, she'd learned to read her older brother better than anyone alive, which meant she knew exactly how little she actually knew. "Byron, this is my wedding. The Castellano family will be there, the Morellis, the Bennetts. Every family with power in this city will be watching who you bring, what alliances you're signaling, what message you're sending." "I'm aware." "Then what the hell are you thinking?" Her voice rose despite her best efforts to remain calm. "Janet Doiron is a bookkeeper. She's nobody. People will think you're mocking them, or worse, they'll think you're weak." Something cold flashed across Byron's face, there and gone so quickly Sophia almost missed it. He stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. "Are you finished?" "No, I'm not finished. I've worked with the Castellanos to make this wedding perfect. Every detail matters. Every perception matters. You showing up with some random employee instead of someone from our world, do you have any idea what that looks like?" Byron walked to the window overlooking the city, his kingdom spread out in lights and shadows below. "It looks like I don't give a damn what they think." "But you should," Sophia insisted, following him. "Byron, I'm not saying this to be difficult. I'm saying it because I know how this works. Dad taught us both. Appearances are everything. Respect is everything." "Dad's been dead for 5 years." Byron's voice was flat, final. "I run things differently." "Different is fine. Reckless is not." She softened her tone, trying a different approach. "At least tell me why. Why her? What's so special about a woman who processes spreadsheets that you'd risk looking weak in front of every power player in the city?" Byron turned to face her, and for a moment, Sophia saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Not anger, not irritation, something else. Something that looked almost like certainty. "I don't explain my choices. Not to them, not to you. Janet Doiron will be my date on Saturday. That's final." Sophia stared at her brother, searching for the logic she knew lived somewhere beneath his impenetrable surface. "You're going to tell me eventually." "Perhaps." "Does she know why you chose her?" "No." "Does she know what she's walking into?" Byron's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She will." Sophia recognized dismissal when she heard it. She'd gotten as much as she was going to get tonight, which was essentially nothing. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "I love you, Byron, you know that. But if this blows up in your face, if bringing some random woman to my wedding causes problems with the Morellis, or the Bennetts, or any of the families we've spent years building careful relationships with—" "It won't," Byron interrupted, returning to his desk. "Trust me, Sophia. For once, just trust me." She wanted to. God, she wanted to. But trust in their world was a luxury they'd learned early to ration carefully. "Saturday, then. I just hope you know what you're doing." Byron picked up the security folder again, effectively ending the conversation. "I always do." Sophia left, closing the door softly this time. In the hallway, she found Dominic waiting like a sentinel. "He's making a mistake." Dominic's expression remained neutral. "Or everyone else is." Janet's apartment was exactly what it needed to be. Forgettable. 3rd floor walk-up in a neighborhood that wasn't bad enough to attract police attention or good enough to warrant security cameras. Beige walls, secondhand furniture from 3 different thrift stores, nothing that suggested permanence or identity, the kind of place a person could disappear into and leave behind without a trace. She locked the door behind her, engaged the deadbolt and the chain, then checked the window locks out of habit. 3 years of this routine had made paranoia feel like common sense. The box was hidden in the one place no one ever looked, inside the oven she never used. Janet pulled it out carefully, the metal still cool against her palms, and carried it to the card table that served as her dining room. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the lid. The badge came first. District Attorney's Office, New York County, Daniel Ashford. Her father's face stared up from the ID photo, younger than she remembered him, before the late nights and the death threats had carved lines around his eyes, before Vincent Moretti's people had put 3 bullets in his chest on the courthouse steps. She traced the edge of the badge with one finger, the metal tarnished now, no longer bright with the authority it once represented. He'd been carrying it that day, though he didn't need to. He'd been going to testify, to put away one of Moretti's top lieutenants for racketeering and murder. He'd promised Janet he'd be careful. He'd promised her mother he'd accept protective custody. He'd promised the U.S. attorney that his case was airtight. He'd been wrong about all of it. The newspaper clipping was brittle now, the paper yellowing at the edges. Prominent DA killed in broad daylight. The photo showed the courthouse steps covered with a white sheet, police tape stretching across the scene, and a quote from the mayor about justice and tragedy. No mention of the witness who'd been standing 30 feet away, close enough to see the shooter's face, smart enough to run before they found her too. Janet set the badge down and picked up the only other item in the box, a flash drive no bigger than her thumb. 3 years of work. 3 years of processing Byron Johnson's financial records, tracking patterns, following money trails that led to offshore accounts in shell companies. 3 years of building a case against Vincent Moretti by documenting how he laundered his blood money through seemingly legitimate businesses, including, she'd discovered 6 months ago, several ventures he co-owned with certain members of the Castellano family. She pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting the headache building behind them. The wedding. Byron Johnson's sister was marrying into the Castellano family, which meant every major crime organization in the city would be there, which meant Vincent Moretti's people would be there, which meant she'd be walking into a room full of the very people she'd spent 3 years avoiding. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. She stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Ms. Doiron. Dominic Kane's voice was as emotionless as always. I'm texting you an address. Be there tomorrow at noon. The stylist will need time. I don't... This isn't optional. Mr. Johnson doesn't make requests. A pause. He also doesn't make mistakes. Whatever you're worried about, he can handle it. The line went dead. A moment later, the text arrived with an address in the Diamond District. Janet looked back at the box, at her father's badge and the evidence of his murder, at the flash drive that contained enough information to destroy Moretti, but also enough to get her killed if anyone discovered what she'd been doing. She should run. She should pack the box, drain her bank account, and disappear into another city with another name and another forgettable apartment. She'd done it before. She could do it again. But her father's face stared up at her from that tarnished badge, and she remembered the promise she'd made standing at his grave 3 years ago, that she'd finish what he started, that she'd make Moretti pay, that she wouldn't run anymore, even if it meant walking straight into the lion's den on the arm of a man who could protect her or destroy her, depending on which secrets came to light first. Janet closed the box and returned it to its hiding place. Then she opened her laptop and began researching what one wore to a Mafia wedding when you were trying not to get recognized by the people who'd murdered your father. The answer, she suspected, was whatever Byron Johnson told her to wear. The address Dominic sent led to a building in the Diamond District that didn't advertise its existence. No sign, no storefront window display, just a brass number plate and a door that required a security code. Janet stood on the sidewalk for a full minute before a black town car pulled up and Dominic emerged. "You're early," he said, which wasn't a compliment. He punched in the code and held the door open, waiting for her to enter first. The interior looked like someone had transplanted a European boutique into a Manhattan high-rise. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and racks of clothing that probably cost more than Janet made in a year. A man in his 40s wearing an impeccably tailored suit approached with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly how much power he held in this particular kingdom. "You must be Janet." His accent was French, his assessment immediate and thorough. "I'm Marcus. I've been dressing the Johnson family for 15 years, so I know what works and what doesn't. Right now, you're what doesn't." Janet's spine stiffened. "Excuse me?" "He means you have potential," Dominic said from behind her, closing the door. "Marcus doesn't waste time with people who don't." Marcus circled her slowly, one finger tapped against his lips. Good bone structure. Excellent posture despite the terrible shoes. Hair could be catastrophic or magnificent depending on who touches it. When did you last have a proper cut? Janet started, but Marcus had already moved on. "Never mind. We have 2 days to turn you into someone who belongs on Byron Johnson's arm. This will require surgery." "Metaphorical surgery," Dominic clarified at Janet's expression. The next 3 hours blurred together in a chaos of measuring tapes, fabric swatches, and Marcus's running commentary on everything wrong with Janet's current existence. She tried on 17 dresses, each one more elaborate than the last, while Marcus and Dominic conferred in low voices about hemlines and necklines and whether certain colors would read as weakness or strength under ballroom lighting. "Black is safe," Marcus announced, holding up a sleek gown that looked like liquid night. "Black says she knows her place. Black says she's not a threat." "No black," Dominic said flatly. "Navy, then. Conservative, appropriate for someone of her station." "She's not attending as someone of her station." Dominic's tone carried an edge Janet hadn't heard before. Byron was specific. She needs to make an impression. Marcus's eyes gleamed with understanding. So we're not hiding the mouse. We're revealing the lioness." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a garment bag. Then there's only one option. The dress that emerged was red, not the soft red of roses or the dark red of wine, but a brilliant arterial red that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Strapless, with a fitted bodice that would demand perfect posture and a full skirt that would command space in any room. The kind of dress that didn't apologize for existing. "I can't wear that," Janet said immediately. "You can and you will." Marcus thrust the dress into her arms. "Red doesn't hide. Red announces. Red says, I'm here and you will look at me," which is exactly what Mr. Johnson wants. In the dressing room, Janet stared at her reflection. The dress fit like it had been designed specifically for her body, which perhaps it had. The color transformed her pale skin into porcelain, made her dark hair look like midnight instead of merely brown. She looked like someone else, someone dangerous. When she emerged, Marcus and Dominic went silent. "That's the one," Marcus finally said, satisfaction thick in his voice. Dominic pulled out his phone, typed something, then showed her the screen. It was a message to Byron. "Found it." The response came immediately. "Good." Marcus wasn't finished. He brought in a hairstylist named Simone, who transformed Janet's practical ponytail into vintage Hollywood waves that cascaded over one shoulder. A makeup artist named Yuki appeared with a tackle box of cosmetics and turned her face into something that belonged in old film noir. Dramatic but not overdone. Powerful but not aggressive. By the time they finished, Janet barely recognized the woman in the mirror. She looked like someone who belonged in Byron Johnson's world. Someone who could walk into a room full of killers and kingpins without flinching. She looked like someone her father would have prosecuted. "Remember," Marcus said as Dominic prepared to escort her out, "the dress doesn't change who you are. It only shows everyone else what you've always been capable of becoming." Janet touched the red fabric one more time, feeling its weight and its promise. "And what if I don't know what that is?" Marcus smiled. "Then I suggest you figure it out before Saturday, because that dress doesn't forgive uncertainty." The Johnson estate sat on 3 acres in the most exclusive part of the city, behind gates that required 3 separate security checks to pass through. Janet had never been here before. In 3 years of working for Byron's organization, she'd never needed to be. Bookkeepers processed numbers in fluorescent-lit offices, not silk-lined palaces. Dominic had picked her up at precisely 4 o'clock, as promised. The ride had been silent, except for his single instruction: don't run. No matter what you're feeling when you see him, don't run. Now she stood in the back seat doorway, staring at the marble steps leading to the entrance, and understood what he meant. The house was beautiful in the way museums were beautiful, meant to be admired from a distance, not lived in. White columns flanked the entrance, and through the open doors, Janet could see a foyer that belonged in Versailles. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across floors so polished they looked like still water. "He's waiting inside," Dominic said, offering his arm. Janet took it because her legs suddenly felt unreliable in the heels Marcus had insisted were non-negotiable. They climbed the steps together, her red dress whispering against the marble, announcing her presence with every movement, just as Marcus had promised it would. The foyer was empty, except for Byron. He stood at the center of the space, hands in the pockets of his tuxedo pants, jacket unbuttoned, bow tie hanging loose around his neck, like he'd been in the middle of dressing when someone told him she'd arrived. His hair was perfect as always, but there was something different in his posture, something less controlled. When he saw her, he went completely still. Janet stopped at the threshold, suddenly aware of how exposed she was. The dress left her shoulders bare, the red fabric catching the light from a dozen chandeliers. Her hair fell in waves she'd never been able to achieve on her own, and the makeup made her face look like it belonged to someone braver than she felt. For 10 seconds, neither of them moved. Dominic had stepped aside, leaving her framed in the doorway like a portrait, like something meant to be studied. Byron's expression cracked, just for a moment, just long enough for Janet to see something raw beneath the armor he always wore. Not quite surprise, not quite recognition, something that looked like understanding dawning after a long darkness. He crossed the space between them slowly, his footsteps echoing off the marble. When he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated, his eyes traveled from her face down to the red dress and back up again. "You look like war," he said quietly. Janet's breath caught. "Is that a compliment?" "It's a statement of fact." He reached up and adjusted one of the waves falling over her shoulder, his fingers barely grazing her skin. "Good. That's what you'll need to be." The casual touch sent electricity down her spine. "I don't understand." Byron's hand dropped, but he didn't step back. "My world doesn't forgive softness, Miss Doiron. It doesn't reward people who try to blend in or disappear. Tonight, you'll be walking into a room full of predators who've spent their entire lives learning to identify weakness." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "You can't be invisible anymore, so you need to be something else." "What?" "Unforgettable." He finally stepped back, giving her space to breathe again. "Marcus did well. You look like someone who belongs at my side, someone who chose to be there, not someone I dragged from the shadows." Janet's throat tightened. "But I didn't choose this." "Didn't you?" Byron's expression shifted back to his usual unreadable mask, but something lingered in his eyes. "You've been hiding for 3 years, Janet. Tonight, you stop hiding. Tonight, you let them see you." The use of her first name landed like a punch. He'd never called her Janet before. Always Miss Doiron, always maintaining that careful distance between employee and employer. "What if I'm not ready?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Byron finished buttoning his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and offered her his arm. "Then you fake it, the same way you've been faking being just a bookkeeper for 3 years." He paused, waiting for her to take his arm. "I know more than you think I do, Janet. Not everything, but enough." Her heart stopped. "What does that mean?" "It means tonight you're under my protection. Whatever you're running from, whoever you're hiding from, they can't touch you while you're with me." His voice was steel wrapped in silk. "But first, you have to walk out that door and into my car. You have to walk into that wedding and let everyone see exactly what you are." "And what am I?" Byron's smile was cold and sharp as a blade. "Mine, at least for tonight." Janet took his arm because there was no other choice, because running would confirm every suspicion, answer every question she'd spent 3 years avoiding, because somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that maybe Byron Johnson was the most dangerous gamble she'd ever taken, or the only ally powerful enough to help her finish what her father started. The car was waiting, the wedding was waiting, and somewhere in that glittering crowd of criminals and power brokers, Vincent Moretti's people were waiting too. The waterfront venue had been transformed into something from a fever dream of wealth and power. White silk draped from towering columns, thousands of candles flickered in crystal holders along a pathway that stretched from the valet station to the reception hall, and the harbor glittered behind it all like a backdrop painted by someone who'd never worried about the cost of beauty. Janet felt the car slow to a stop, heard the muted sounds of voices and music filtering through the bulletproof windows. Beside her, Byron sat with the absolute stillness of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Remember," he said, not looking at her, "you belong here. Act like it." The door opened. Dominic stood waiting, his expression neutral, but his eyes alert, scanning the crowd that had already begun to notice their arrival. Byron emerged first, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease, then turned and offered his hand. Janet took it and stepped out into the light. The whispers started immediately. She heard them ripple through the crowd like wind through wheat, saw heads turn and conversations stop mid-sentence. Camera phones appeared from evening bags and jacket pockets, flashes popping in the growing darkness. The candle-lit path stretched before them like a gauntlet, lined on both sides by the most powerful and dangerous people in the city. Byron's hand moved to the small of her back, warm through the thin fabric of her dress. "Walk slowly," he murmured. "Let them look." So she did. She lifted her chin the way Simone had taught her, kept her shoulders back the way Marcus had insisted, and placed one foot in front of the other in the ridiculous heels that suddenly felt like weapons. The red dress moved around her like liquid fire, catching every candle flame, every camera flash, announcing her presence to everyone who'd come to witness a union between two crime families. "Is that Johnson? Who is she? I've never seen her before. That's not Adriana Benetti. That's not anyone." The voices floated past her, disbelief and curiosity mixing with something sharper, something that felt like threat assessment. These people were predators, just as Byron had said, and she was something new in their territory, something that didn't fit the established patterns. Halfway down the path, Janet recognized Senator Morrison's wife staring at her with undisguised shock. 3 steps later, she caught sight of Marcus Castellano, Sophia's soon-to-be father-in-law, his expression shifting from confusion to calculation. Then Sophia herself appeared at the entrance to the reception hall, stunning in white lace, her face a careful mask that couldn't quite hide her concern. Byron's hand pressed slightly firmer against Janet's back, a silent message, "Keep going." They passed a group of men in expensive suits who went quiet as Byron approached, then immediately began whispering once he'd moved past. Janet caught fragments. Message, strategy, whose daughter? She wanted to tell them she wasn't anyone's daughter anymore. That title had died on courthouse steps 3 years ago. Byron, a woman's voice, smooth as honey and twice as deadly, cut through the whispers. How unexpected. They stopped. Byron's hand remained steady on Janet's back as a woman in emerald silk materialized from the crowd. She was beautiful in the way diamonds were beautiful, cold, sharp, and valuable. Her eyes assessed Janet with the precision of an accountant cataloging assets. "Byron," Byron said with polite indifference, "you look well." "I look available, darling, unlike some people. I don't believe we've met." She extended a manicured hand to Janet. "Adriana Benetti. And you are?" Janet felt every eye on them, felt the weight of this moment crystallizing into something that would be discussed and dissected for months. She took Adriana's hand with a grip her father had taught her, firm but not aggressive, confident but not challenging. "Janet Doiron," she said clearly. "It's lovely to meet you." "Doiron," Adriana repeated, rolling the name over her tongue like she was testing it for authenticity. "I'm not familiar with that family." "That's because it's not a family you need to know," Byron said, his tone leaving no room for further questioning. He guided Janet forward, leaving Adriana standing in their wake. They climbed the steps to the reception hall entrance, where Sophia waited with her new husband, Antonio Castellano. Up close, Janet could see the tension in Sophia's smile, the way her fingers gripped Antonio's arm just a fraction too tightly. "Janet," Sophia's voice carefully neutral, "welcome." "Your wedding is beautiful," Janet offered, because it seemed like the right thing to say when the bride looked like she was barely containing her fury. "Thank you." Sophia's eyes moved to her brother. "Byron, we need to talk later." "Later," he agreed, steering Janet through the entrance. The reception hall opened before them, a ballroom of crystal and candlelight, where hundreds of guests mingled beneath chandeliers that looked like frozen stars. The band was playing something classical and refined. Champagne flowed from fountains, and everywhere Janet looked, she saw people staring at her. Byron's hand pulled her close, his mouth near her ear. "You did perfectly. Now comes the hard part." "What's the hard part?" Janet whispered back. "Surviving the next 3 hours without anyone realizing you're terrified." He lifted 2 glasses of champagne from a passing waiter and handed her one. "Smile, Janet. You just became the most talked about woman in this room. Make them wonder if they should fear you or court you." Janet took the champagne and smiled like Marcus had taught her, mysterious, confident, dangerous, like someone who belonged on Byron Johnson's arm, like someone who'd chosen to walk into a room full of killers wearing red, like someone who wasn't running anymore. The first hour passed in a blur of introductions and carefully neutral conversations. Byron kept Janet close, his hand never leaving her back or her elbow, steering her through clusters of power brokers and crime lords with the practiced ease of someone who'd been navigating these waters his entire life. She smiled when she was supposed to smile, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and let everyone believe she was exactly what she appeared to be, Byron Johnson's mysterious new companion. Then Antonio's best man called for a toast, and Byron was summoned to the head table. "Stay here," he told Janet, positioning her near a column where Dominic could maintain line of sight. "I'll be back in 5 minutes." She watched him walk away, his shoulders cutting a path through the crowd, and tried not to feel like she'd just lost her only anchor in a storm. Around her, conversations continued in the careful language of people who said everything without saying anything at all. She nursed her champagne and concentrated on breathing steadily, on maintaining the mask Marcus had painted on her face. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks. 3 years of looking over her shoulder, 3 years of seeing her father's killer in every crowd, every shadow, every stranger's face. But this time, her mind wasn't lying. Frank DeLuca stood at the bar 20 feet away, his back to the crowd, ordering bourbon with the casual confidence of a man who belonged anywhere he chose to be. He wore a dark suit that almost concealed the bulk of his shoulders, the kind of build that came from violence, not vanity. His hair was grayer than she remembered, threaded with silver at the temples, but she'd memorized every detail of his face during those 15 seconds on the courthouse steps. The slightly crooked nose, the scar above his left eyebrow, the way he held himself like a coiled spring. The man who'd put 3 bullets in her father's chest while she watched from 30 feet away. Janet's champagne glass tilted in her hand, the crystal stem suddenly slippery. She caught it before it fell, but her fingers had gone numb. Her pulse hammered so loudly in her ears that the music and conversation faded to white noise. He hadn't seen her yet. He was focused on the bartender, on the drink being poured, on the transaction that meant nothing and everything. But it was only a matter of time. The reception would continue for hours. People would circulate. Paths would cross. She needed to leave, now, before he turned around, before their eyes met and recognition shattered like the glass she was barely holding onto. But her feet wouldn't move. She was frozen in the same paralyzing fear that had gripped her on those courthouse steps, watching her father's blood spread across white marble while Frank DeLuca climbed into a black sedan and disappeared into traffic. "Miss Dewan?" A woman's voice, close and concerned, one of Sophia's bridesmaids, someone Janet had been introduced to and immediately forgotten. "Are you all right? You look pale." Janet forced her mouth to work. "I need some air." "Of course, the balcony's just through those doors." But Frank was picking up his bourbon now, turning away from the bar, scanning the crowd with the practiced awareness of someone who made their living noticing things others missed. His eyes swept across the ballroom, cataloging faces, assessing threats, doing exactly what Janet had been trained by her father never to do, drawing attention through observation. Their eyes met. For one suspended heartbeat, Janet saw confusion flicker across Frank's face. He didn't recognize her, not yet. The red dress, the hair, the makeup, she looked nothing like the 23-year-old law student he'd glimpsed fleeing from the courthouse 3 years ago. But confusion wasn't ignorance. Confusion meant his brain was working, pulling up files, comparing faces. Confusion meant he'd figure it out. "Excuse me," Janet said to the bridesmaid, her voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She set down her champagne on a nearby table and turned away from Frank DeLuca, away from the bar, searching the crowd for Byron's tall frame. Behind her, she heard Frank's voice, rough and unmistakable. "Hey, wait!" She walked faster, not quite running, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The crowd seemed to thicken around her, bodies blocking her path, conversations creating walls of sound and silk and expensive cologne. Where was Byron? The head table was across the ballroom, past a sea of guests and round tables decorated with white roses. "Janet." Dominic appeared at her elbow, his hand firm on her arm. "What's wrong?" She met his eyes and saw that he already knew something was wrong. He'd been watching. That was his job. "The bar," she whispered. "The man in the dark gray suit, he's—" She didn't need to finish. Dominic's expression hardened into something cold and professional. "Don't look back. Stay with me. We're going to Byron. Now." He guided her through the crowd with efficient purpose, his body blocking her from view, creating a moving shield between Janet and the ghost who just materialized from her nightmares. But she could feel Frank's eyes on her back, could sense him trying to place her face, to solve the puzzle of why a woman at a Johnson wedding looked familiar, trying to remember where he'd seen her before, trying to remember if he'd left any witnesses alive. Dominic cut through the crowd like a blade through silk, his hand firm on Janet's elbow, his body angled to keep her hidden from the bar where Frank DeLuca had been standing. Janet's vision had narrowed to a tunnel, her breath coming too fast, every survival instinct her father had taught her screaming that she needed to run, hide, disappear before Frank's confusion crystallized into recognition. Byron was at the head table, mid-conversation with Marcus Castellano, when Dominic's approach made him look up. One glance at Janet's face was all it took. He stood immediately, not bothering with excuses or explanations, and crossed the distance in 3 strides. His hand cupped Janet's face, forcing her to meet his eyes instead of scanning the crowd for threats. "Look at me," he commanded quietly. "What happened?" Janet's mouth was dry, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave." Byron's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, something sharp and dangerous that Janet had only glimpsed before. He turned to Dominic. Threat? Possible recognition, gray suit at the bar, been watching her. Byron's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked back at Janet, his thumb brushing her cheekbone in a gesture that might have seemed tender if his eyes weren't calculating exit strategies. "Can you walk?" She nodded, even though her legs felt like water. "Then we walk, calmly, like we're getting air." His hand dropped to her waist, pulling her close against his side. Over his shoulder, he caught the attention of 2 men Janet recognized from the security detail who'd been positioned near the exits. A subtle nod, a gesture with 2 fingers that looked like nothing to anyone watching, but they moved immediately. Byron guided Janet toward the terrace doors, his pace measured, his expression bored. Just a man taking his date outside for a moment of privacy. Nothing unusual, nothing worth noticing. Dominic followed 3 steps behind, his hand inside his jacket. "Byron!" Sophia appeared in their path, her bride's smile strained. "Where are you going? Antonio's father wants to meet." "Later." Byron didn't stop moving. "This is my wedding, and you'll still be married in 10 minutes. He leaned in close, his voice dropping. "Trust me, Sophia. Stay inside, keep Antonio inside. I'll explain later." Something in his tone made Sophia step aside. Janet saw the fear flash across her face, quickly masked but present. She'd grown up in this world. She knew that when Byron used that voice, people listened or people died. They reached the terrace, the cool night air hitting Janet's overheated skin like a slap. The harbor stretched out below them, dark water reflecting city lights. Byron's hand never left her waist as he steered her toward the stone steps leading down to the parking area. "Where's the car?" Byron spoke into his phone, his voice clipped. 30 seconds, came the response. Behind them, Janet heard the terrace doors open, heavy footsteps, a voice she recognized like a nightmare. "Hey, Johnson, that your date?" Byron stopped, his entire body going still. He turned slowly, positioning himself between Janet and Frank DeLuca, who'd followed them outside with the confidence of a man who didn't fear much. "DeLuca," Byron's voice was ice. "Enjoying the wedding?" Frank's eyes were on Janet, squinting slightly, his brain still working through the puzzle. "Yeah, beautiful ceremony. Your date looks familiar. We met before?" "No," Janet said, forcing her voice steady. "We haven't." "You sure? Because I swear I've seen you." The armored Mercedes pulled up at the base of the steps, its engine purring like a predator. Byron's security detail materialized from the shadows, 6 men who suddenly made the terrace feel very crowded, very deliberate. "I think you're mistaken," Byron said, his tone final. He guided Janet down the steps. "Enjoy the reception." Frank took a step forward. "Hold on, I just want to—" 2 of Byron's men moved between them, not threatening, just present, large and immovable, and carrying enough firepower under their jackets to start a small war. Frank stopped, his hands rising slightly in a gesture of surrender, but his eyes stayed on Janet, memorizing her face, filing it away to be pulled up later when he had time, to think, to search old photographs, to remember. Byron opened the car door himself, practically lifting Janet inside. She slid across the leather seat, her red dress bunching around her legs and her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. Byron climbed in after her, Dominic taking the front passenger seat, and before the door even closed, they were moving. "Go," Byron ordered the driver. The Mercedes accelerated smoothly, professionally, fast enough to be urgent, but not fast enough to attract attention. Through the tinted windows, Janet watched the waterfront venue grow smaller, watched Frank DeLuca standing on the terrace surrounded by Byron's security team, his face illuminated by candlelight and confusion. Status on Sophia. Byron entered his phone. Secured. 6 men inside, 3 on perimeter. She's safe. Byron ended the call and turned to Janet. His expression was no longer carefully neutral. It was focused, intense, and absolutely relentless. Now, he said quietly, you're going to tell me everything, starting with why Frank DeLuca looked at you like he was trying to remember where he'd buried the body. Janet met his eyes and knew she was out of time, out of hiding places, out of lies. Because 3 years ago, she whispered, he killed my father, and I watched him do it. Byron's private office occupied the top floor of his downtown headquarters, a space designed for power rather than comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city he controlled, and the conference table could seat 12, but currently held only 5. Byron at the head, Dominic to his right. 2 other members of his inner circle Janet recognized but had never spoken to, and Janet herself, still wearing the red dress that had been meant to announce her arrival, not her destruction. The confession had taken 20 minutes. 20 minutes to dismantle 3 years of carefully constructed lies, to lay bare the truth she'd hidden beneath spreadsheets and silence. Her real name, Janet Ashford, daughter of District Attorney Daniel Ashford. Her father's murder on the courthouse steps while he was preparing to testify against Vincent Moretti's lieutenant. Her decision to disappear, to change her name, to infiltrate Byron's organization because his financial operations intersected with Moretti's in ways that could finally build the case her father had died trying to make. The flash drive sat on the table between them, containing 3 years of evidence. 3 years of tracing money, documenting transactions, mapping the network that connected Moretti's drug empire to legitimate businesses, including several he co-owned with members of the Castellano family. Byron had listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The others had remained equally silent, though Janet caught Dominic's slight nod when she'd mentioned the flash drive, confirmation that he'd suspected something, even if he hadn't known what. When she finished, the silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like hours. Then Byron leaned back in his chair, a cold smile touching his lips. Vincent Moretti has been a problem I've wanted to eliminate for years. His eyes met Janet's across the table. Congratulations, Janet. You just gave me the perfect excuse. The response stunned everyone in the room, including Janet. What? Moretti's been encroaching on my territory for the better part of a decade. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking, operations I don't touch because they're poison that eventually kills everyone involved. He's made himself untouchable by spreading his connections wide enough that taking him down would create a power vacuum that benefits no one. Byron tapped the flash drive with one finger. But if someone had evidence that could put him away legally, that could dismantle his organization through prosecution rather than war, that changes everything. You want to help me? Janet's voice came out skeptical. I just admitted I've been using your organization to gather intelligence against another crime boss. I've been spying on you for 3 years. You've been doing your job for 3 years, Byron corrected. Every transaction you processed was legitimate. Every account you reconciled was accurate. You didn't steal from me. You didn't betray me. You used your position to watch Moretti through the small windows where our businesses intersected. He stood, walking to the windows. That's not betrayal. That's resourcefulness. Byron, one of the other men said carefully, if we move against Moretti, We're not moving against him. The FBI is. The U.S. Attorney's Office is. We're simply providing them with the evidence they need to do what they should have done 3 years ago when Daniel Ashford was preparing to testify against Moretti. Janet's throat tightened at her father's name spoken so casually. And what do you get out of this? Besides removing a competitor who deals in businesses I find morally reprehensible, Byron returned to his seat, his eyes locked on hers. I get an ally who's smart enough to spend 3 years undercover without getting caught, who's brave enough to walk into a room full of killers wearing red, who's driven enough to honor her father's memory by finishing what he started. He paused. And I get the satisfaction of watching Vincent Moretti spend the rest of his life in a federal prison instead of dying quickly, which is what would happen if I handled this my way. You're serious, Janet breathed. I don't joke about business. Byron gestured to Dominic. Starting tomorrow, you'll work with my legal team and my accountants, the ones who handle my legitimate operations, not the ones who process gray area transactions. We'll build a case so airtight that even Moretti's lawyers can't find the cracks. Then we'll hand it to someone at the Justice Department who can't be bought. Why? Asked Janet. Why help me? Why risk your relationship with the Castellanos when Moretti has connections to them? Byron's smile was sharp as a blade. Because Antonio Castellano came to me 3 weeks ago asking for help. His family's business interests with Moretti have become a liability. They won out, but they can't extract themselves without looking weak or becoming targets. He leaned forward. You just gave them the perfect exit strategy. Moretti gets arrested, their connection dies with him, and they come out looking like innocent businessmen who had no idea about his criminal activities. The pieces fell into place in Janet's mind with sickening clarity. You knew. When you chose me for the wedding, you already knew who I was. I suspected, Byron admitted. Your background was too clean, your qualifications too strong for someone content to process numbers in a third-floor office. So I had Dominic investigate. We discovered your real name 3 days ago, your father's case, the courthouse murder. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. I chose you for the wedding because I wanted to see if you'd run or if you'd stand. You stood. And if I'd run, I would have let you go. Byron's voice carried absolute certainty. But you didn't run. You walked into that reception like you owned it. Even when you saw DeLuca, you didn't run. You came to me. He stood, offering his hand across the table. So now I'm asking, do we have an alliance? Janet looked at his extended hand, at the flash drive on the table, at the men surrounding them who could kill her or protect her, depending on which decision she made in the next 10 seconds. She thought about her father, about his badge in a box hidden in an oven, about 3 years of hiding and gathering evidence and believing she was alone in her fight for justice. She took Byron's hand. His grip was firm, warm, and surprisingly gentle. We have an alliance, Janet said. Byron's smile was genuine this time. Good, because Frank DeLuca recognized you tonight, which means Moretti will know your real identity by morning. So you're moving into one of my secure properties, you're getting 24-hour protection, and you're going to help me destroy the man who killed your father. He released her hand, but held her gaze. Welcome to the war, Janet Ashford. Let's finish what your father started. Outside the windows, the city glittered with promise and threat in equal measure, and for the first time in 3 years, Janet felt something she thought died on those courthouse steps alongside her father. Hope. Janet Ashford spent 3 years invisible. 3 years processing blood money in a fluorescent-lit office while gathering evidence against the man who murdered her father. 3 years believing she was alone in her fight for justice. Then Byron Johnson walked into her office and changed everything. She wore red to a room full of killers. She faced her father's murderer without running. She stopped hiding and started fighting. And now she has the most dangerous man in the city willing to help her finish what her father died trying to do. If this story made you feel something, if you felt your heart stop when Janet saw Frank DeLuca at that bar, if you felt the weight of her father's badge in that hidden box, if you believed for even 1 second that justice might actually win, then don't just scroll past. Subscribe to this channel, because stories like this, stories about daughters who refuse to let their fathers die in vain, about women who choose war over safety, about the dangerous alliances we make when the world gives us no other choice. These are the stories I tell. And if Janet's courage means something to you, if her 3 years of pain and planning moved you in all, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because you don't abandon people who refuse to give up, and you shouldn't abandon the stories that remind you why fighting matters.